Good day, and welcome to Leadership Perspectives. In each edition of this series, we are able to listen to experienced leaders as they share ideas for us to consider and grow as we develop within our own leadership identities. In this conversation, we hear from Dr. Makeeba McCreary regarding equity-focused leadership. This is Makeeba's perspective. What's yours? Hi, Makeeba. Thank you for joining us today. And if you don't mind, please start by introducing yourself to those watching this video.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me join you. My name is Makeeba McCreary. I am here in Boston, Massachusetts, and I run a fund that is focused on dismantling systemic racism. We think that we will do that by disproportionately investing in Black and Brown leaders across the Commonwealth. Prior to that, I had a career in several administrative roles and some deep time in the K-12 system, both nationally, but even more directly here at the Boston Public Schools. So this is a pleasure to get a chance to talk about leadership and what development looks like.
Thank you. Yeah, and the first question, it's a little broad, so you can take it in any number of directions, but just wanted to hear from you about what you think it means to be an educational leader who is equity focused, particularly an educational leader in K-12 who's equity focused.
You know, I come fundamentally from a special education background, and so I did a lot of work initially in what we call 0.5 schools here in Massachusetts, which is one step before residential. And that was a very, very beginning of my career 30 years ago. And I can say that over time, I would often proselytize that these kids actually would benefit from nothing that is uniquely unbeneficial to any other student who's in regular education. So that means that, you know, if there's an opportunity to deconstruct a workbook and chunk it, or if there's an opportunity to work in smaller groups or to change the pace or the timing of something that needs to be delivered, that's actually really good teaching, generally speaking. And so, you know, always argued that young teachers should probably get more special education training that they could use in a mainstream classroom. And then I had my own child who was born with hearing loss and has worn hearing aids for his entire life. And it was all the more clear to me that he needed a classroom that didn't have a lot of background noise happening, that the AC rattling while he was trying to receive information was really problematic. But I always thought it's probably not working for a whole bunch of other young people in that classroom. So when you ask the question, what does equity-based instruction look like from my perspective and leadership look like? It's that conversation of like, am I actually, you know, doing extra for this singular individual or group, or is this a way for me to shift my practice so that holistically everybody can get access to what I'm trying to share? That's just one way that I think about that.
Thank you. Yeah, and certainly in special education, there are a number of examples of inequities or ways that we're not serving students who have been identified as being served by an IEP. And beyond that, we talk race, class. So thinking about any number of categories, what are some examples that may come to mind of inequities that you've seen in the system, so to speak, that people maybe aren't properly noticing or addressing, or both?
Hands down, leaders, people in roles where they're leading, whether it's a teacher or an administrator or a specialist, like not stopping to think about what their own background was and how different it might be from the young person that they are interacting with, or their colleague. Or somebody that's working for them, as a leader of a school, to think about where your different teachers hail from, what their experience was, how they got into the role that they're in, dramatically shifts the way that they, perceive the delivery of quality education. And I think it's the difference of the way that I've seen it played out most traditionally is, for example, as an educator, me being in a classroom and not understanding that there's a young person who comes who's Asian and may come from a household where there's a teaching about, what being respectful looks like to an adult. And my perception of that may then be that they aren't paying attention to me or that they're refusing to engage, when that is not at all the case. But then I've placed judgment on that young person and decided that to extend it to my decision about whether they want to learn or not. And then all of a sudden it becomes very emotive and my whole, approach to them has shifted.
Thank you. And in your work, in Boston Public Schools and then in other arenas as well, I'm sure you've seen many frustrating situations, which I think are really important to interrogate. And I also wanted to peel back on some positive examples so people can learn from some things that have happened where something has been done or action has been taken and it's made a difference for students or families or staff members. So what are a positive example or two you can think of where that encourage you and that you can draw some hope from in relation to addressing systemic inequity?
I think, we have to remember how much power we have. And that power is very it has the potential to be very intentional. In both in the negative, but also in the positive, to your point. And so I happened to be chief of staff to the superintendent when I was at Boston Public Schools. And so I had a lot of power. I had a lot of ability to make, certain things happen or not happen. But so did the school leaders, so did the teachers, so did the paraprofessionals, so did the custodian. And, I can give one example that I think I'm not a great rule follower anyway, so this is maybe not the best of stories, but I had the ability to address a school bus that a mom was waiting for her child to get picked up every day. And she was consistently 30 minutes late to work because one school bus would pass by that her son was not assigned to. And then his bus would come and then he would get on that. And so she was just making a simple request. Can my son be transferred to this other bus? And, the rules were no, that can't happen. That's not his route. And I was able to make they had the authority to make a decision to change that. And it changed the experience for that mom. She was able to, get to work on time and continue to earn a living to serve her family. And that little boy was able to get to school, his same school, without having to see his mom under pressure and stressed. And so that toxicity really, can translate right into the classroom, as every single educator knows. Kids don't walk in and like it's clean slate. It's everything that happened the night before, the morning of, on the way to school, or what they're anticipating when they get home. I think I've also seen, teachers in classrooms stop the instruction and think about who's not engaged, who's checked out. And instead of that being a punitive moment, it's a moment where you're able to actually, do a one-on-one in the moment and figure out, what's going on with that student, maybe give them a chance to take a walk, give them a chance to come sit next to you, and get, special attention. I've seen that happen time and time again with really great educators. So I think the moral of the story is, our job, when we are responsible for 24 kids in a classroom, up to the 56,000 young people I felt responsible for as chief of staff across our district, is to understand how much power you have to make very small decisions that will have huge impact on the experience of the people that we are in service to. And I want to really double down on that. Like, this is, that's the job you sign up for in a leadership role in any industry, but in particular in education, is that you are in service to that family and to those children. And that's a big responsibility. So I think really understanding how pivotal one's power is critical.
Thank you. And yeah, I think I appreciate the idea that even little decisions can have big impacts, and a series of little decisions can even magnify or make exponential these impacts, and those impacts often end up influencing our students who may have either the greatest need or may be experiencing marginalization in other ways in our society. And so as we think about need in public schools and in K-12 schools in general, oftentimes the subject of poverty comes up, but many times I feel like people are more comfortable discussing poverty than race. So let's focus the conversation for a moment on race and think about, when you think about inequities, what do you think are a couple things around race that maybe people's eyes aren't seeing, or people aren't noticing? And oftentimes those would be people who identify as white, but not always, because it's to some degree the water we're swimming in, and people may not take a moment to notice the temperature or the pH of that water. So let's focus on race for a moment and think about what kinds of inequities would you like to point out to people that they could hope to address?
Sure. I don't take credit for this. I had the privilege of being in the audience listening to Brian Stevenson not too long ago talk about his work in building his museum in particular. And he said something really interesting near the end. He said, one of the biggest challenges with this US as it relates to Black and brown people, but particularly Black people, African Americans, is that we don't talk about our history of slavery as having happened. Like, there's no interrogation of that. There's no explicit deconstruction of that for young people in their educational systems. As a matter of fact, as much as we can sort of hide the ball somewhere and turn it into a story about like a singular, heroic moment or an individual who we are going to iconicize, but not talk about really like the act of enslaving people, which is what allowed this country to be built upon, right? And the difference is he talked about the Jewish community, the Jewish faith and community, and how they will insist that like there is absolutely no way that you can forget that the Holocaust happened. It's it's something that is talked about, taught about, convened around, and to the end of making sure that that doesn't happen again. And so there's something to be said for like erasing somebody's history, so the past, and particularly a history that it allows that to continue to manifest and to fester. When Mr. Floyd was murdered, all of a sudden, this country was also in the middle of this pandemic that we all realized we were incredibly vulnerable. And I think his murder was so atrocious, but it was not an anomaly. And nobody could look away. Everybody had to stare straight at it and say, is this who we want to be? Is this where we want to live? But, had we continued to talk about Mr. Floyd and paid attention to that, would we have had the other dozen deaths that have taken place at similar hands of law enforcement of Black and brown individuals, whether they had mental health, challenges, or whether they were, but all of these things continue to happen and we have looked away. And I think it makes it easy to do that when we're not willing to actually talk about it and have tough conversations. And young people can have the toughest of conversations. Like, they are not afraid to talk about race. It's us, it's the adults. And so I think the more that we can embrace the idea that we need to be really uncomfortable, but we've got to have the conversation, we've got to chronicle that we've allowed that to happen here in this country, and we continue to allow it to happen. And young people are paying attention.
Thank you. And yeah, I appreciate the way you pointed out some specific examples and drew a parallel to the atrocities of the Holocaust and how that's handled and and discussed. And it makes me think of how that's handled in K-12 in comparison to the way other pieces of history have been often handled. So not shifting gears, but continuing forward, I'll give you a few sentence stems, and then you can take them, where you want to. So the first one is, in relation to equity-focused leadership, that big, broad category. I have learned that
in relationship to equity-focused leadership, I have learned that until somebody is willing to do their own work, black, white, purple, green, blue, whatever, and understand their own identity, the flaws and the beautiful nature of that identity, they are not going to be able to engage around somebody else's identity in a way that's respectful and fruitful.
Thank you. Something I feel many leaders may not understand is.
Something I feel many leaders may not understand is that it's okay to be quiet and to listen and to learn. Leading is not always being in front.
Thank you. I used to think, now I think.
I used to think a lot of things. Let's see. I used to think that there was some real influence that was necessary from systems, from legislative systems, or from infrastructural systems and educational institutions. And honestly, here in Boston, we've been through multiple superintendents over the past decade. And it's not necessarily now I think this, but I did realize quite early on that were it not for the autonomy of those school leaders, our kids would have been in even worse trouble than they have already been in. But we had school leaders who were able to continue to push forward and take care of their families and their children and their educators, in spite of the chaos that was happening in our central offices and in our sort of legislative systems and bureaucracy.
Thank you.
So right on to the principal.
Power to the principal. As a leader, the future I'm working toward is.
As a leader, the future I'm working towards is one that will allow my son to feel safe and nourished and curious as he sort of explores his own future.
Great. As we work towards wrapping up, not there yet, but what have we not talked about that feels like it probably belonged in this conversation? Something I didn't ask about, or a topic that just didn't come up that's either near to your heart or near to the topic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so much. I would say, if I'm sort of speaking to the crowd, I would say, like, as much as we say that we understand that it's not the work of the oppressed to educate the oppressor, I just want to say that again, that there is little to no responsibility on a person of color's part to make sure that their white ally is up to speed on what their experience is. There's so much reading, there's so much incredible media, there are so many different ways to access the story of and I'm honing in on the person, the Black or brown, because that's what I am and that's what I bring, but really, delete that and apply it to anything else, the transgender, the elderly, the second language, as English is a second language, student or learner. Go do your own work and figure it out and learn as much as you can, because then you can come into a conversation with your own equity, right? With your own ability to have inquiry and say, I have some questions about something that I learned. or that I've read, and I want to fact check with you, and I want to actually understand a little bit more deeply, if you would be willing to share that with me. And in return, there should be reciprocity. So be willing to teach somebody else about what your perspective is and what you've been raised to, how you've been raised to understand the world.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's powerful and, and certainly fitting. I think fitting in any conversation about leadership and education. But certainly fitting for this, which, this series of, conversations is entitled Leadership Perspectives, and the idea that, we all have a perspective, and that, this conversation is based on listening and hearing from people of, who have different ideas and thoughts, but also identify differently. I identify as a white male. So if I'm teaching a course and, sharing my perspectives are partly informed by my experience, but also partly informed by the way I identify. And so I think it's powerful to be able to hear a variety of perspectives, not just in this series of, conversations, but in our daily work and in our continual learning.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of addressed this, so no pressure to add more, but I suppose there's always more as well. Just any message to share with these current leaders, and some of the folks watching this are emerging leaders who are growing into their leadership identity. What message or messages would you like to add on for them?
I would circle back to the sort of lesson number one, like, know when to be quiet and listen. There's a lot of opportunity there, but I think the second is, be vulnerable enough to ask for help. Be vulnerable enough to ask for help and model that. There's always someone watching you. There's always somebody learning from you. And so, the pressure is on, you have to consider that your humanity is being imperfect. And at the same time, right, there's very little margin for a lot of multiple mistakes of the same kind, but certainly enough grace to say, as you are learning, you are growing, and other folks around you will appreciate that and will honor that space for you. I do believe that.
Thank you. I think that's inspiring, and appreciate your time, Makeeba, and thank you for sharing with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We hope that Makeeba's ideas support you on your own leadership journey. She shared her perspectives regarding equity-minded leadership. What are your perspectives?